So in this next section, we want to talk about some efficiency models, thinking about what are some cost-effective ways of delivering development interventions. Now, we'll look at a few case studies. The first one that we'll look at is how best to deliver bed nets to combat malaria in Africa. Let's start with some key facts on the prevalence of malaria. In 2017, there were an estimated 219 million cases of malaria in 87 countries. The estimated number of malaria deaths stood at about 435,000 in 2017. The World Health Organization African region carries a disproportionately high share of the global burden of malaria. In 2017, the region was home to 92% of malaria cases and 93% of malaria deaths. Total funding for malaria control and elimination reached an estimated 3.1 billion in 2017. This shows the magnitude of the malaria problem, and there is a lot of commitment to eradicate malaria. Now the question is, what is the most efficient way of doing it? And so let's consider then some efficiency alternatives. Now, a simple solution we can think about is to distribute insecticide-treated bed nets. So it's been established that this is a very effective way of preventing the spread of malaria. So insecticide-treated bed nets are one of the most effective tools for preventing malaria, but there's an ongoing debate on what is the most efficient way of delivering these insecticide-treated nets, or ITNs as they are called. And so the efficiency of the delivery of the ITNs will go a long way in ensuring that these ITNs are distributed to as many people in as many places as possible. So the debate is whether or not to distribute these bed nets for free. So there is no issue about whether or not the bed nets are necessary. The issue is how should they be delivered? Should they be distributed for free, or should they be distributed at a fee of a certain amount? Now, there is a big debate within the academic community and the development community as well. So on the one side, there are those who support the idea that these bed nets should be distributed for free. So for example, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, they hold this position. And then on the other side, there are those who argue that there has to be a positive price for the distribution of these bed nets. So for example, William Easterly is one of the proponents of this argument. Now, the reasons that are raised for why bed nets should be delivered at a price, there are a few reasons. The first is that, so there is a concern that if you give people these bed nets for free, there'll be a waste, they'll want to use them, and so that just becomes a waste of resources, or not the best use of resources. And also, there have been findings from different research on malaria, which have shown that up to 40% of bed nets which are acquired for free end up becoming unused, and purchased bed nets are more likely to be used than free ones. Now, a study estimated that as many as 264 million bed nets are needed to reach about 80% of vulnerable groups in Africa. So there's so much need, and so how can the limited amount of resources be best used to reach so many people? So should those bed nets be distributed for free, or should they be distributed at a price? And perhaps the question is, it's not a question of should they be distributed for free, but should they be distributed at a subsidized price, and how much should they be subsidized? So here's a key policy question. what is the optimal price to charge for a bed net? So we need to start by unpacking this question. And some key questions that we can ask is, if people must pay for bed nets, will they purchase them? Will they afford them, right? And when people get bed nets for free, will they use them? So that's the other side of the argument. If it's free, will they use it, or it'll just be wasted? And also, do free bed nets discourage future purchases? So if people are getting them for free now, will they bother to buy them in the future? And also, do neighbors buy nets if others are getting those nets for free? So these are some questions we can think about, and also we can think about some efficiency options then. And perhaps one option would be to come up with a voucher scheme. And so, for example, women in Tanzania received vouchers at antenatal clinics, which they were able to redeem at local shops to purchase subsidized bed nets. So this approach, the voucher approach, involves the market. So bed nets are subsidized, or they're given for free, but they're given the form of a voucher. So this ensures that the market, the local markets, participate in the intervention. So that's one approach on sustainability. And another potential solution, so with respect to bed nets, positive prices play an important role in motivating the local markets to distribute and sell bed nets. So get the local markets involved. The goal of malaria programs is not to only achieve high coverage of bed nets today, but to maintain high coverage levels after donor attention and donor presence and support has ended. This is very important because it leads to sustainable solutions which involve the markets. But what does the evidence say? So Jessica Cohen and Pascal Dupas of MIT conducted a randomized controlled experiment in Western Kenya to assess which options on delivery mechanisms for bed nets were the most effective and efficient. They compared a cost-sharing mechanism where beneficiaries had to pay part of the cost of the bed net. So they compared that mechanism versus a free delivery mechanism where beneficiaries did not have to pay anything. They got the bed net for free. The beneficiaries in this experiment were pregnant women. And so some got the bed nets for free, some had to get them at a subsidized amount. So it was a cost-sharing approach. Now, the findings from this study were published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2010, and the findings suggest a number of things. So the study results suggest that cost-sharing methods of distributing these insecticide-treated bed nets may have a limitation in reaching a large fraction of the most vulnerable populations, as opposed to giving people bed nets for free. So higher prices for the bed nets create a drop in demand, which is not offset by increased usage. And so this cost-sharing approach is likely to lead to low coverage and less people getting these bed nets. And they also find that demand drops by 60 percentage points when the price of the bed nets increases from 0 to 60 cents, a decrease of the subsidy from 100% subsidy to a 90% subsidy. And so the study estimates demand elasticities and usage elasticities and uses the estimates in a model of cost effectiveness that incorporates both private and social benefits of these insecticide treated bed nets. And what the study finds in this cost effectiveness model is that free distribution is more cost effective than cost sharing mechanisms. So the study also finds that the number of infant lives which were saved as a result of the free distribution of bed nets was highest when the bed nets were given for free than when they were given at a subsidized rate. Now, there are some common criticisms that free distribution leads to leakage to non-beneficiaries, or it leads to wastage, or there may be reselling of the bed nets, and so on. Now, this study tested these criticisms and found no evidence that free distribution generates higher leakage of bed nets to non-beneficiaries. To the contrary, the study found that more leakage and theft occurred when prices were higher. So when people had to pay higher prices for the bed nets, that's when there's all these challenges with corruption and with reselling and so on. And also there was no evidence of a second-hand market in areas where these bed nets were distributed for free. And also the retention rate was above 90%. So the people who got the bed nets for free, 90% of them kept on using them. So this was a randomized experiment and addressing this question of the effectiveness of this delivery mechanism. So that sounds very positive, but then we have to think about, could these results be overstated? So the Cohen and Dupas study reports that over 90% of the bed nets were still in use, contrary to popular criticisms that when you give these bed nets for free, they won't be used. Now, Mead-Over, who is an emeritus fellow at the Center for Global Development, argues that this high retention rate could have been driven by the way the program was designed and also the social context around it. So there was a residual demand for bed nets because the beneficiaries were pregnant women. So this was a unique context. And so there was a higher chance that these bed nets would be used. But this may not be the case in another context. So the bed net distribution had extensive demand promotion activities as well. And also there were social marketing campaigns that came along with the free distribution. And this may have also led to these high retention rates. And the bed nets were not always free. They were highly subsidized, but not free. So some of the findings do not reflect free distribution, but high subsidization. So what is being identified here are some of the limitations, and that perhaps these results may be overstated. So, and also another important criticism is that the study does not adequately consider the supply side effects. So it considers the demand side. But what does a free distribution policy do to the supply side of the commodity? So Mead-Over goes on to argue that the randomized controlled trial was on the demand side and not on the supply side, and there really needs to be a more rigorous analysis of the supply side effects of the market with these kinds of interventions. And this will help governments and donors better understand how incentive mechanisms can be made more efficient. There is also a challenge of external validity, that these findings on the free distribution impacts of bed nets, can they be generalized for other places as well? So can the findings from Western Kenya be a standard for how bed nets should be distributed in other parts of the world? Now, the challenge is there may be differences in a number of things in other parts of the world. So, for example, there may be differences in the market structure, in consumer preferences, consumer attitudes, consumer willingness to pay. There may be differences in levels of poverty, and also there may be different institutional factors. For example, differences in dynamics with corruption and institutions. And so the findings from Western Kenya may not be applicable to other parts of the world. So this raises the point that findings from one study should not be overstated, because they are more of region-specific knowledge and they may not be broadly applicable to other parts of the world. So the findings from this particular study should be explored and tested in other areas as well to inform policy debates on bed net distribution. So that's the one example on efficiency models and weighing the different or competing mechanisms for delivering an intervention, thinking about whether an intervention should be free or it should be subsidized, and what are the pros and what are the cons.